Okay, continuing Chapter 13. Payroll-related liabilities, payroll taxes, and withholding. There are two types of payroll-related liabilities, which we'll first distinguish in terms of who bears their costs. Um, some payroll-related costs are expenses to the employer. Social Security and Medicare taxes, as well as state and federal unemployment taxes, fall under the heading of payroll taxes. In addition to payroll taxes, there are other payroll costs that the employer bears. Things such as retirement contributions, contributions to a 401k plan, health care or other insurance premiums, matching charitable contributions. For example, making donations through United Way, your employer might match those donations. These are all additional forms of compensation costs, so they could broadly be classified as compensation expense. The point is that these costs are all in addition to the gross wages of the employee. So for the employer, he has compensation costs, broadly in three categories. There's the gross wages expense, the hourly or the hourly wage of the employee or the periodic salary. There's the payroll tax expense, those things, again, the Social Security and Medicare, state and federal unemployment taxes. And there are also these forms of other forms of compensation, the fringe benefits and so on. Now, just as an aside, the employee and the consumer ultimately bear all of these costs. Payroll taxes and these other incidental costs raise the cost of hiring an employee. In that case, the employer really has two options. First, they can try to raise the price of their product to pass the costs along to the consumer. In that case, that impoverishes the consumer because their consumption dollars don't go as far. And also, by raising the price of your product, demand, of course, is going to drop for your product, which means less production, which means perhaps less employment. So you might have to, lay off or not hire some employees. The other alternative is if you can't increase the price of your product, then you have to lower the wage paid to your employee. If the employee's, what they call from your econ class, the marginal revenue product is $20,000 annually, you can't pay the employer more than $20,000. If if payroll taxes or healthcare mandates or things of that nature increase, to keep the total below 20,000, you have to reduce the actual compensation, the wages paid to that employee. Even Congress can't repeal the laws of economics. Other payroll costs are borne by the employee in the sense that they come out of the employee's gross pay. If your gross pay is $800, of course your check is going to be for substantially less than that. There are a lot of other people who get a piece of your paycheck. First, of course, we have the government. We have federal income tax withholding, state income tax withholding, local income tax withholding, and Social Security and Medicare tax withholding. In addition to those mandated costs, there are some other deductions that you might be subject to. If your employer offers health insurance, you probably pay health insurance premiums, which are deducted from your paycheck. Charitable contributions. I donate to United Way through through deductions from my paycheck, and so Penn State withholds some money and gives it to United Way every pay period. Retirement contributions. Penn State, at my direction, takes X% of my pay and directs it towards a mutual fund for my retirement funding. And then, of course, union dues, generally 1%, at least commonly in my experience, 1% of your gross pay. And again, union dues have the same effect as the payroll taxes in terms of their economic impacts. Unions exist, they exist to enrich their members at the expense of everybody else in society. You increase the wage costs or employment costs through union contracts, those additional costs either get passed along to consumers in the form of higher prices, harming most of all the poor who can't afford the higher prices, or they, if you increase the price of your product, that reduces demand, it reduces employment levels. Again, these costs don't add to the employer's expense; they all come out of wages expense. So the employer acts as a paying agent or as a conduit for making these payments to other parties. So just pulling numbers out of thin air, if your gross pay is $800, you might have the following entry: wages expense for the gross pay, and then a whole list of payables in terms of who's going to get that $800. And basically whatever isn't given to the taxing authorities or to other parties is what's left for the employee, in this case $510 out of $800. Okay, so what do you need to take away from this part of the chapter? First, don't worry about specific tax rates, the FICA or Social Security and Medicare tax rates, or the unemployment tax rates, or things of that nature. The textbook does go to some length to do examples with specific rates, and the problems ask you to use specific rates. But the problem is, or not the problem, the issue is that by the time you graduate, those rates are going to change. Just recently, for example, we had the tax cuts a few years ago. They temporarily lowered the payroll tax rates, the Social Security and Medicare tax rates. The idea being, of course, that lowering tax rates will induce employers to hire more people. The economics of that, I'm not sure how sound that was. If you advertise that a payroll tax cut is going to be temporary, it's questionable whether an employer would make the long-term decision to expand production and hire more employees if he knows that the reduction in tax rates is only temporary. Be that as it may, the rate has now gone up as a part of the solution to the fiscal cliff problem. And again, the rates change, and there's no reason to commit them to memory at this point. What you do need to worry about is how they're recorded. That is, who bears which cost from an accounting perspective, not from an economic perspective. Payroll taxes and sort of the incidental compensation costs are an expense to the employer. Other costs are rolled into payroll tax, other costs are included within wages expense, those costs which are borne by the employee.